Iran's president, Ebrahim Raisi, died in a helicopter crash this week alongside Iran's foreign minister. The usual suspects came out to blame Israel, but all indications are that bad weather and an aged aircraft were likely to blame. Who was Ebrahim Raisi, and what will change for Iran as a result of his death? Welcome to another episode of Headlines in History with me, your host, John Malik. Today I want to shift back to Iran, somewhere we've been before, as we spent a good time talking about China, Mexico, and the United States last week with the fentanyl crisis. If you haven't listened to that one and you're interested in how fentanyl production and use in the United States is tied into the Taliban, into China's future plans with Taiwan and regional hegemony, go ahead and listen to the last episodes. It's some pretty interesting stuff. Certainly more of a focus on the domestic side of the house, but an interesting discussion nonetheless. Weekly caveat: although I remain in the business, I do not speak for the U.S. Army, the Department of Defense, or the government in any way. All of my opinions are my own, and all of my information is open source. Okay, let's jump right into the topic. Arguably the most popular and relevant foreign affairs story of this past week was the death of Iran's president, Ebrahim Raisi, in a helicopter crash. He was traveling with an entourage, which included Iran's foreign minister, to meet with the president of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev. Forgive my pronunciation. The two were meeting to include their entourage to celebrate the opening of a dam in the Dizmar forest, which is located about just 12 miles inside the border with Azerbaijan, way up in the north of Iran. Both Iran and Azerbaijan have been at odds over resource management for a few years now, and this event was supposed to be a peaceful reconciliation of sorts between the two countries. The crash occurred on the return flight, so both did meet. It took hours to find the wreckage, as the weather was so bad that aerial assets were of no use. This should give you an idea of what the pilot was dealing with in trying to return Raisi back to Tehran. Turkish officials got involved in the rescue operations, and they claimed to have identified the crash through drone surveillance, which pointed rescuers on foot to the scene. And when they got there, what they noticed was really a fiery mess. So the helicopter certainly crashed pretty hard, and there was I don't want to call it an explosion, but there was certainly a fire after the helicopter hit ground. Now, of course, when something like this happens, all fingers point to conspiracies about Israel, assassinations, all of these nefarious activity. A high-profile figure is killed that benefits some nation, particularly Israel, or even the United States, and automatically that nation is guilty of assassinating a foreign leader. Admittedly now, the details are a bit murky, at least as of today, May 30th. And with Iran, we may never know what actually happened. But let me say a few things. First, when dealing with logic, we have to mind a few rules. And if you don't mind the widely accepted rules of logic, then you're not using it, right? And there are 4 generally accepted rules of logic. And in this case, we would use the 4th law, which is called the law of sufficient reason. It can be explained in a few different ways, but basically, everything that happens in the universe either needs a cause or a reason. Specifically, sufficient cause or reason. Additionally, just because something can be true, it can be the cause or the reason, doesn't mean it's sufficient or even true. Now, why do I bring this up in the first place? Well, these are rules that intelligence analysts like to abide by so we can reach logical conclusions when we are assessing complex problems. But more directly, because claiming Iran caused the helicopter to crash just because it could be the cause or reason doesn't mean that it is. In this case, we have to consider a few things. One, the helicopter was old. It was a Bell helicopter made in Fort Worth, Texas in 1979. Right, so the aircraft was over 50 years old. Now, just because the aircraft was old doesn't necessarily mean it crashed for that reason. But let's be honest and admit a helicopter with today's technology is likely more stable than one made 50 years ago. Additionally, the weather was awful. So awful, in fact, rescuers couldn't use rotary aircraft, like I said, to locate the crash site. And I think we can all agree weather is the biggest factor in air flight mishaps. Now, I'm not a pilot myself, but generally accepted, weather is the biggest enemy to anything in flight. No matter how advanced your aircraft, if you fly through bad weather, bad things can happen. Commercial aircraft don't skirt bad weather just because things get bumpy. It's also dangerous to do that, regardless of what you're in. To me, this is what seems the most logical about this crash. Weather. Now, I'll also add, admittedly, that doesn't mean Israel wasn't involved, and maybe we will find out later, but my money is on weather and the fact that sanctions have hurt Iran's ability to keep its helicopters flying. Now, that also raises another point. Why is your president flying in a helicopter made in America, mind you, there's some irony there, that's 50 years old? I don't want to hear the sanctions response, even though there is some truth to the sanctions issue, but Iran still finds ways to build missiles and nuclear power plants underground. So you'd think if they figured out a way to skirt sanctions so they can build missiles to shoot at Israel, then they would find a way to buy a new helicopter or borrow somebody's. I don't know. I guess it's just depends on what your priorities are. Either way, we'll see. Who knows what happened? We obviously don't know what it is as a fact. Just give you the logical answer that seems most likely. I'll bring out Occam's razor again. The simplest explanation is most likely the right one. You fly an old helicopter into bad weather over the mountains of Azerbaijan, you're going to have a problem. Now, in terms of the sufficient reason or cause, the other reason I would give you as to why Israel is not likely involved is the fact that it doesn't provide them any benefit, at least that we know of, right, through open sources. President Raisi was considered what they call a hardliner who hated Israel and was determined to keep the Islamic Revolution going. And so he's not somebody that Israel would like to have in power. But who cares? Because there are so many other hardline Iranian politicians. And ultimately, at the end of the day, which we'll talk about throughout the episode, is that it doesn't even really matter who the president is. All that matters is who the Ayatollah is. So, but either way, there are no lack of hardline leaders willing to take the president's role after an incident like this. And there are people already in line. Yes, the Ayatollah is going to have to groom another leader, replace him, which again, we're going to talk about. And not everybody is exactly the same. So, the Ayatollah is going to have to go back to the drawing board, if you will, because Raisi was considered the most likely replacement for the Ayatollah when he passes away. He's 85. But again, there are plenty of hardliners. And I would ask, does killing the president, a hardline president who is going to be replaced with another hardline president, does it warrant risking the repercussions for doing so? Israel's busy right now fighting in Gaza. And I just don't see how they would take such a risk and get all of the international pushback on knocking a helicopter out of the sky that kills the president of Iran, who really isn't in charge anyways, and who's just going to be replaced by somebody like him. It just doesn't seem to make any sense. Again, Occam's razor. Simplest answer is likely the right one. Helicopter hit bad weather coming over the mountains and it crashed. Helicopters tend to do that. As happens in the international geopolitical world, multiple countries sent condolences, some warm, some not so much. Of interest, Saudi Arabia said, quote, "It stands by Iran in these difficult circumstances," end quote. And then the United States came in. The U.S. State Department said, quote, "We reaffirm our support for the Iranian people and their struggle for human rights and fundamental freedoms," end quote. Sounds about right. A couple of days after the crash, Iran officially acknowledged the the crash itself without giving any reasons for why it happened, and then most likely never will. Tens of thousands of people filled the streets in Tehran to mourn, but don't let that fool you. There are many, many more people who didn't show up. I mean, tens of thousands, good enough, okay, but again, plenty of people who didn't. Now, interestingly though, 68 countries did send diplomats to the funeral, which I will admit is a bit surprising given Iran's position and in the international geopolitical sphere today. 68 seems like a lot, but I think most were there. It would make most sense to me, based on my experience, that they were there to kind of ascertain Iran's next move in their political system, not so much that they were tearful that Raisi fell out of the sky. Just an assessment on my part, but big boy geopolitics there, as former General Petraeus used to like to say. That's the reality of the situation. People are going to show up. They're going to pretend they care about the president, but ultimately what they're really looking for is some information on where Iran is headed. Okay, so that's the event that occurred. Heading into Azerbaijan, helicopter crashes. I'll make the claim it's likely weather. But now Iran has to move forward. But before we do that, before I get into what I think is going to happen afterwards, I think it's smart to build a little bit of a foundation here. So first, let's go into, this is headlines in history. So let's go into Raisi himself, where he's from, who he was as a person, as much as we can know about somebody like that. And then a little bit into the Iranian political system, how the government operates, how these elections, quote unquote elections, are going to happen, and then what may come out of this. All right, so Raisi himself, he was born in 1960. He was born into a devoutly religious family in Mashhad. And Mashhad is considered the center for learning for 12er Shias, and is also the location where the 8th Imam, Ali al-Rida, is buried. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's relevant for those that aren't experts in the Shia version of Islam. Anyways, Mashhad means place of martyrdom, because the 8th Imam, who is interred there, did die of poisoning, according to history. So it's an apt name. But the history of all that's really a whole separate episode. But anyways, it's the second most populous city in Iran, right behind Tehran, has a little bit over 3 million inhabitants. It's located in the northeast, almost way up on the border of Turkmenistan, if you can kind of visualize that. Now, to talk about why the Imam's burial is important here, not only important to Raisi, but really important to the Iranian Revolution as a whole, which, by the way, Raisi did play a pretty significant part in 1979. He was 19 at the time. Shias believe, unlike Sunnis, that there's a direct line of Imams that can be traced all the way back to Ali, and Ali being Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law. But that in this successive line of Imams, the last one, and it really kind of depends on your version of Shiism as to who you believe is actually the, quote, last one. Most Shias, 86% across the world, believe there were 12. So, and hence why they call them 12er Shias, but technically there are like 9er Shias, as just another example. But most are 12er, and most of everybody that lives in Iran is a 12er Shia. So, but anyway, so the 12th Imam is missing. He's gone. Nobody knows where he is. He's living in a place called occultation, which is an Islamic term for, the only thing that I could compare it to in any tangential way would be purgatory in a way, but purgatory is really a place for death of humans to go, but it's similar. It's like in this transitive place that you're held, okay, spiritually. And this 12th Imam, who's gone missing, is not going to return until Allah chooses for him to do so. When he does return, Shias believe, he's going to return with Jesus to bring peace to the entire world, and Islam will eventually take over, if you will, as becoming the only and unified religion of the world. Now, I said just a minute ago that the fact that Raisi was born in Mashhad is important because Mashhad is a devoutly religious place within Iran. Because the fact that the 12th Imam is missing and everyone that believes in Shiism is waiting for his return, it's the whole purpose of the revolution in 79 that Raisi played a role in. And that's clearly what the Ayatollah believes, the current Ayatollah. It's what the previous Ayatollah and original Khomeini believed, that everyone should be living under the Shia version of Islam and doing whatever they need to do within that belief system until the Mahdi returns. And so Raisi did have a very strong connection to that belief system, which allowed him to become such a close confidant of the Ayatollah. Because the Ayatollah really isn't going to allow many individuals close to him that do not hold the same religious beliefs with the same strength. Now, from a practical sense, why Mashhad is also significant, not only just because it's a religious center, but because during the Shah's time, and the Shah being in control, someone that the United States and the British put in or allowed to take control of Iran after pulling Mossadegh out in 1953, he had a more nationalized idea of how Iran's economic system should work. And so these smaller religious centers, like Mashhad, who operated kind of on their own and operated and maintained their local economy, felt like they were not only being influenced by Tehran in a secular way with the Shah, because the Shah was relatively secular if you put him in comparison to someone like the Ayatollah, and that those living in Mashhad were being mitigated and minimized in their religious belief. And this is the atmosphere that Raisi grew up in the 70s, when this fervor was rising throughout the country. This religious fervor was rising, and he was experiencing it directly because he lived in one of those religious towns that was being affected by Tehran and its secular influence. So it's like a double factor, if you will. The fact that it was a religious town and he wanted to be part of the revolution because he didn't want to be bothered by the Shah. He began his religious instruction, his official religious instruction, in the famed Qom Religious Seminary when he was just 15, so in 1975. Again, just a couple years before the actual revolution. And he grew to respect the teachings of Ruhollah Khomeini, the original Ayatollah, and Khomeini's teaching of Velayat Afaqi, which roughly means that in the absence of a divinely inspired imam, remember the 12th is missing, Islamic judges should lead all political dealings within Iran. This is what the Ayatollah sees as the way Iran should live before the imam returns. And those within the judicial system, the religious judicial system, those that understand the Quran deeply and can make religious determinations, not only just in the legal sense, but in any moral or ethical way, that they should be the leaders controlling the Sunnah, the populace before the imam returns. This is where he begins in his teens to fall in love with this revolutionary mindset. He was a prosecutor into his 20s before he made it to Tehran. He's also married. He got married in 83 and has two daughters. So Raisi's a family man, if you will. Well, he was. So he starts his religious training at 15, becomes a prosecutor, takes law school, eventually makes it out of Mashhad into Tehran. Skip forward a little bit to some of the more interesting and important events that occurred in his life. Just know that he was a prosecutor and came through the ranks after the revolution. He really hit the media, and he really became an international figure because of something he did in 1988, right at the tail end of the Iran-Iraq War. This is where his behavior led for him to be called the Butcher of Tehran. And he got that title because he oversaw, as an executive of what they call a political committee, the execution of approximately 5,000, potentially 5,000 political prisoners, like I said, in 88. This is a point that's brought up in the media a lot. So let's take a second and just take a look at what event occurred here for the Butcher of Tehran. He led what was often called the Death Commission, and it was created to punish leftist political members after the war between Iraq and Iran, which began in 80 and lasted until 88. So there were some political action figures, if you will, in Iran that attempted to take advantage of the environment and shift the power centers in Iran. And when the war was over and the Ayatollah and his minions were able to focus again domestically, the first thing they did was started killing a bunch of these political prisoners, some of them prisoners at the time, some of them free, but either way, killing a bunch of these political leftists who attempted to take advantage of what was happening between Iraq and Iran. Now, interestingly, an audio leak in 2016 proved that Raisi was part of the commission in 88, and it brought his participation to the fore. He never denied being part of the program and what happened in 88, but he also doesn't admit the killings. Right? So, but just to give you some context, Amnesty International describes the incident as, quote, thousands of political dissidents were systematically subjected to enforced disappearance in Iranian detention facilities across the country and extrajudiciously executed pursuant to an order issued by the supreme leader of Iran and implemented across prisons in the country. Many of those killed during this time were subjected to torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment in the process, end quote. This now is from an article from Amnesty International's website that was posted in 2018 called Blood-Soaked Secrets. So the edict that they're discussing or they're describing there is really a fatwa, which is a religious edict that came from Khomeini. And additionally, the actual fatwa that was written down gave more credence to the fact that Iran's most senior leaders were involved, to include Raisi, who had been a prosecutor in Tehran. He wasn't the most senior at the time, but he was a senior prosecutor in Tehran at this time. And I'll leave the link in the show notes down there to the source. The next year, 1989, after this death commission, this is when Raisi becomes the senior prosecutor in Tehran. And it's right when the Ayatollah, the original OG Ayatollah Khomeini, died in 89. So Khomeini was the Ayatollah for a decade, 79 to 89. He quickly rose through the ranks under the new Ayatollah, Khamenei, with an A, not an O, who is the current Ayatollah. And he eventually became Attorney General of Iran in 2014. So a pretty high-ranking position, at least in the judicial system. After about 2 years doing that, he resigned and became the executive leader of what's called the Ostan Quds Razavi, which is really the biggest religious endowment in all of Mashhad. And this was in March of 2016. This endowment, of which there are many in Iran, is called a banyad, which is akin to like a charitable trust, and is really, really integral to Iran's economy. In fact, these banyads, all of them, they make up about 20% of Iran's economy as a whole. This particular one that Raisi was a part of, or was leading rather, is thought to be the longest running in all of Iran's history, 1,200 years. Why is that important? That's important because there's a lot of money that runs through these charitable trusts and is, again, like I said, an integral part of the Iran's economy. So he got some great experience working with money and the importance of the financial system within Iran after he had spent so much time in the judicial system. He did hold some other concurrent positions too at the time when he was doing these things. He was a member of the execution of Imam Khomeini's order. We often call it like EIKO, E-I-K-O. And this is going to come up a couple times. And this entity was responsible, and it still exists, but was responsible for taking possession of all properties that didn't have owners after the 79 revolution. So in 79, the government falls, the Shah's government falls, Khomeini and his minions take over in Tehran, and whoever couldn't prove ownership of whatever their property was at that time, this entity was designed to absorb all of those places and those locations and give them to the revolution itself that's now in Tehran. He was also a prosecutor of the special clerical court and responsible for handling cases of corruption and crime within the clerical ranks. And that to me is a big position, an important position in my eyes, because it gives him substantial influence, right? This is where Raisi would have known all the dirty secrets of the clerics across the country. And given the importance of the judicial system in Khomeini's idealized version of Islam, it's safe to say he's not putting just anybody in this role. So the fact that the lead prosecutor for all the clerics and the imams who don't do the right thing is a big deal. After his time there in 2016, he then ran for president in 2017, but he did lose to Hassan Rouhani. And Rouhani is the president at the time who helped broker the 2015 JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Raisi strongly opposed that deal that Rouhani had agreed to, because although they're all hardliners, if you will, Raisi was a little bit more of a hardliner than Rouhani. Rouhani agreed to this JCPOA. We'll talk about it. So for the benefits of those that don't know the particulars, so the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, JCPOA, like I just said, was an agreement created between the Obama administration in conjunction with the other permanent UN security members, UK, Russia, China, France, as well as Germany and the EU. It was referred to as the P5+1. Complicated deal, but at its most basic level was an agreement to lift certain sanctions on the Iranian regime, which had placed on the regime since the outset, which would then, in theory, boost the economy and provide economic relief to the everyday Iranians, which is ultimately what the West wants, is to increase the quality of life with the everyday Iranian, and why wouldn't we? And in return, we would get a promise from Tehran to allow detailed inspections by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, that could verify that Iran wasn't refining uranium to a level needed to create nuclear weapons. This is as basic as it gets. We get a deal. We'll give you some of your sanctioned money back. You give us access so we can ensure that you're not building nuclear weapons. It was a temporary agreement, and this is one of the issues that many had that didn't agree with the plan, which was meant to give Iran 10 years to reduce their total number of centrifuges and lower their stockpile of low-enriched uranium to 300 kilos and their mid-enriched uranium to 0. And then there's also high-enriched uranium, which is what you need for weapons. But anyways, it's a process, so it goes from low to mid to high, and we were trying to get them to keep their lower enriched uranium to such a level that we knew they couldn't get to what is often called the breakout period, where they would have enough enriched uranium to produce a weapon. You only need the low enriched uranium in order to have nuclear power, which is what Iran claims that its nuclear plan is for, just power. At year 15, all the bets were off and restrictions would be lifted. The plan, though, wasn't really ending per se. It was meant to be renegotiated after 10 years. And so then they could determine, they being all the parties involved, can determine that the agreement could be re-extended or extended, and maybe some of the numbers in terms of what they can have, how many kilos of which and what would be reevaluated. Anyways, but once the next administration, at least the next U.S. administration came in, President Trump, they unilaterally pulled out of the deal, thinking that reestablishing the sanctions would reduce funding, particularly for Iran's proxies, the Houthis and Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Shia militia groups in Iraq in particular. So the Trump administration's view was the Obama administration was just giving sanctioned money back to Iran, which is going to go directly to the proxies. They're never going to be honest about it. So why are we doing any of this? And so they pulled out. The fact of the matter is, though, that clearly didn't work. I mean, just take a look at October 7th in Israel. What it did do, though, is it did demonstrate to the world, specifically Iran, that the U.S. couldn't be trusted to keep its agreements. So in this sense, Raisi, his belief that the U.S. couldn't be trusted was proven right. And in his mind, in 2018, when the U.S. pulled out of the deal, he was right and Rouhani was wrong. So as you might imagine, when he ran again for president in 2021, this time he got 62% of the vote. At least that's what they tell us. Raisi ran on the claim that the U.S. couldn't be trusted. Rouhani was wrong. And Raisi began to support Khamenei's idea of what was called a, quote, resistance economy, which one that relies less on external factors and focuses on internal markets that specifically protects against the vacillations, if you will, of external countries, which is exactly what happened between one administration and the next. So that's what made Raisi different than Rouhani regarding JICPOA. And the people that do make these decisions as to who's president and who isn't saw that because of what the Trump administration did, maybe Raisi was right, and this whole negotiating with outside entities just is nonsense. What does it even really matter if somebody's just going to pull out? President Biden's administration, just as an aside, attempted to restart the negotiations, but no deal. Didn't happen. And so since 2021, President Raisi has been president until the other day when he crashed. That's kind of his story. So the real mark that Raisi left on international diplomacy, if you will, with Iran was that he wasn't trusting of anyone and wanted to keep Iran not so much isolated, but at least responsible for its own economic success, and was not interested in dealing with anyone else. Those were his intentions, and he stuck to it. So now let's transition to post-crash. What's going to happen going forward? So like I said earlier in the show, Ayatollah replaced Raisi temporarily. And he did that with the acting vice president, or the vice president at the time, Mohammad Mokhber. So the vice president is now the temporary president. 68 years old, he was born in 1955 to a clerical family, shocker, in Dezful, which is a town almost directly west of Isfahan and close to the Iraq border, so if you can visualize that. It's the capital of Khuzestan province. Less is known about Mokhber because he was an academic. I mean, there's some things that we know, but he's more of an academic, and he's got multiple doctorates. At least that's the claim. I don't have a reason not to believe that, but just saying. And he spent most of his time behind the scenes. He has held some significant positions, however. He was the deputy provincial governor and obviously the first vice president. So deputy provincial governor of his province, and then obviously first vice president. But he just doesn't have a lot of the same flashy stories as somebody like Raisi or even former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who was believed to have played a role in the hostage crisis in 79, 89, so just more of a media connection. Although, interestingly, he was also head of ICO, that execution of Imam Khomeini's order, like I mentioned earlier, just like Raisi. So there is that direct connection between the two there. Seems in the reading that I've done that if you held that position as the executive in ICO, then that's a position of great favor and likely put you on a path to the most senior of leadership positions. When Mokhber was there, though, as ICO executive, he did promise, this is during the COVID years, and he did promise like millions of COVID vaccine doses during the pandemic, which never happened, and then nobody ever talked about it. So funny. But anyways, he has been sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury for a time for forcibly taking property while he was at ICO. So I said earlier that ICO was set up to take a hold of property that was not claimed after the revolution, but that it still exists, and it does still forcibly remove property for a whole number of reasons and give it to the power players in Iran. So the U.S. Treasury has come out and sanctioned them for that behavior. So Mokhber, he's going to sit in the presidential seat until the, quote, elections in June. And again, they're going to be on the 28th. He did give his first speech this week to Parliament. He did praise Raisi's work. He was highlighting some oil sales that skirted sanctions as a key economic victory. But again, and that was part of the, quote, resistance economy, where they're trying to skirt these sanctions and try to ensure that they can kind of keep the economy going without any outside influence. But anyway, so how is this transition of power going to happen? In order for us to make an assessment of what's going to happen next, we got to take a look at what Iran's government structure is like. It's a bit unique. First, the leader of Iran is called the Rahbar, the leader of the revolution. Originally, it was Ayatollah Khomeini from 79 to 89, and now it's Ayatollah Khamenei. The Rahbar controls all aspects of foreign policy. He can amend bills whenever he wants, complete control of the military, and oversees that ICO organization I brought up without any budget approval from anybody. He's technically elected by a body that is called the Assembly of Experts, which are made up of 88 individuals. But the Rahbar is responsible for picking a good portion of those Assembly of Experts. And so you wouldn't be surprised that no one's ever had a claim to have ever had an issue with the Ayatollah or the Rahbar. So shockingly. But technically, the Assembly of Experts is supposed to elect the senior Ayatollah, the Rahbar. Next, you have the Guardian Council, which approves all candidates for the legislature, because there is a legislature, all candidates for president, and appoints all members, technically, of the Assembly of Experts that I just mentioned, but with the influence from the Ayatollah. So they just do what they're told. Additionally, constitutionally, the Guardian Council is the authority to oversee all elections. They can veto anything that comes out of the legislature. And they can deny anyone run for office from the local level all the way up to the presidency. And the Guardian Council, 12 members, 6 of them are appointed by the Ayatollah. The president is the head of state, so more of a domestic responsibility, and technically elected. But even if he is elected, he's not sworn in until the Rahbar or the Ayatollah agrees to swear him in. So even if for some way, as the system is set up to just allow the Ayatollah to take control and do whatever he wants, even though somebody may squirt by, then if the Ayatollah doesn't sign the president into office, it doesn't matter anyways. And then, like I had mentioned, there's a parliament, legislature. It's unicameral, one body, consists of 290 members, and it's just a joke. Don't even need to get it really into it. So like I had said, what's becoming pretty clear here is that the Ayatollah, the Rahbar, and the Guardian Council, really, they just run the country. So unimportant, like day-to-day business can be handled by the parliament and the president, things that just aren't relevant, that kind of keep the cogs spinning, if you will, but everything goes through the Ayatollah, if it has any consequence. Now, there's a perception that there are elections, and so on the 28th, they will have presidential elections. Anybody who's over 18 can vote. There's universal suffrage. Again, if you're an adult, quote unquote adult, used to be 15, now it's 18. And even so, believe it or not, many countries even set up voting areas for Iranians in the diaspora. Many countries across the world. So Iranians, wherever they are, can vote for the president. They do this every 4 years before they have another election. So as you might imagine, again, given that the Guardian Council approves all the candidates, in reality, the Ayatollah dictates who runs, and then who he ultimately approves as the winner and signs him in office. So that's what's going to happen in June. There will be no surprise elections. There will be no, for Democrats, Mr. Trump beat Hillary Clinton. Doesn't work that way. So who's it going to be? That's the big question. Right now, because of the way that Iran operates, right, in a foreign policy perspective, they don't tell anybody anything. All we have is speculation. They don't have open media. They don't have those things. So there are some names being thrown around by analysts that are out there that watch Iran very, very closely, much more closely than I do. There's an individual by the name of Ali Larijani. He was the former culture minister. He was a speaker in parliament. Also the Supreme National Council, Security Council secretary, had some senior roles. Another is a guy by the name of Saeed Jalili. He was the Ayatollah's representative in the National Security Council. He's also like a huge supporter of Iran's nuclear program, which, no good for us. Parvez Fatah, current head of the ICO. Again, there's that position again. He's also on the list. He was also a top official in the IRGC, so the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is Iran's most effective military force and answers directly to the Ayatollah. So he's in the running. And there are a couple other names out there. even Hassan Rouhani is potential, although he has been also nominated, if you will. He's been assessed as, not nominated, but he's been assessed as a potential successor to the Ayatollah himself. But if you look at them in the list of the candidates here, and it ties back to my point earlier, they're all hardliners, quote unquote hardliners, in their own way. There's, at least as the analysts see them, they look at the responsibilities of the Iranian presidency in the same way Raisi did, and that is resistance economy, pro-nuclear weapons program, or nuclear program, quote unquote nuclear program, and they all hate Israel. They have their judicial experience, which the Ayatollah likes. They have their clerical experience, and they're all very close in some manner or form to the current Ayatollah. So they're different kind of in their own ways, but no two people are alike. At the end of the day, a hardliner is a hardliner. And so again, like I had said, that ties back to the earlier part of the conversation, and that is, why would it be of interest for Israel to be involved in knocking this helicopter out of the sky if the replacement is the same guy, in essence, as Raisi? It doesn't make any sense. Also, Israel's busy. So we'll see what happens when it comes to the elections on June 28th. We'll see what kind of turnout there was. There was not a big turnout in 2021, it was reported. Again, it doesn't really matter. We'll find out who the new president is, and we'll kind of just continue going forward as is. Looks as if we are not going to be put in a position to, again, reestablish JCPOA conversations, which means that there are no more inspectors seeing the most intimate locations in the nuclear program. Now, let's not be naive here. I'm not making the claim that even when the JCPOA was in effect, that the IAEA inspectors saw everything, but it was reported that they did see a lot more so than they had it even in the past, and they believe they had a pretty good idea of where the nuclear power was at the time, at least the enriched uranium process was at the time. And that even agreed to some of the intelligence assessments that were out there that eventually became open source. So that's not coming back anytime soon. So inspectors are gone. Sanctions have been reinstated. But again, the actions of Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis are causing a ruckus down in the Red Sea, consistently shooting at ships in order to cause international maritime economic disturbances. And then you have the Shia militia groups who pop up and shoot at Americans and bases in Iraq. It doesn't matter where the sanctions are. Iran's still getting the money. They're getting the money from international donors. They're getting it from other countries. I mean, right now, Iran is in the process of selling weapons, or at least ammunition, to Russia. Russia's getting it from Iran and North Korea, and they're not doing that for free. So sanctions or no sanctions, we're still going to have to be dealing with the proxies, but we have no ability to get closer into determining where they are in their potential nuclear program. And that is the ultimate concern. I mean, Iran is a problem currently because it's meddling throughout the Middle East. Iran is a problem because it trades Hezbollah. Iran is a problem because it funds Hamas. Hamas went on October 7th and caused the issue with Israel. Now Israel's in Gaza. So, the world, the Middle East in particular, but the world would be a much safer place if the regime in Iran no longer existed. And this is something that most of the Western world hopes happens organically. And the people of Iran are able to choose who they actually want to live under. Because believe me, there is a very large, youthful demographic in Iran that want nothing to do with the clerics and the religious figures that are in Tehran. And what we don't want is for Iran, given all of those things, what we ultimately don't want is for them to get their hands on a nuclear weapon. For obvious reasons. We don't want countries that we don't think are going to act rationally having the ability to destroy other countries. It may not be fair, right? But the United States wants to be in a position that, they have nuclear weapons, their allies have nuclear weapons, and people like North Korea don't. Unfortunately, they do, but we want to limit that. There are assessments out there, given the religious outlook of the Ayatollah and what his intentions are to hold down the fort, if you will, until the 12th Imam returns, if he's not able to sit in Tehran and allow for that to occur, if his regime is ever threatened to a point where it may no longer exist, if he had a nuclear weapon, what would he do with it? I mean, the man and his minions come out in public and say over and over and over and over again, we want Israel to be wiped off the face of the earth. It's the great Satan. It's the little Satan. The United States is the great Satan. And if I could, I being Khomeini, right? If I could press a button and get rid of Israel, he would do it. Now, that doesn't mean that he necessarily is actively really trying to get his hands on a nuclear weapon. Don't know. There are assessments out there that said if he really wanted one, he would have one. But anyways, but he certainly wants to be in a position where he can hold the cards and say, if I'm ever put in a spot where I know somebody is going to come and remove me from power, March 2003 Iraq, then I can say no because I have this nuclear weapon at hand. North Korea gets away with it. He wants to be able to get away with it. At least that's the assessment. And so, tying back to the conversation we're having today, the Ayatollah is 85 years old. He's not going to be around forever. Raisi was supposed to be the guy, just as much of a hardliner as the Ayatollah. So he's not an option. But everybody else that's going to come and fill Raisi's role in the presidency and could potentially then turn into the Ayatollah, they're all kind of the same. And so, generally speaking, very little change. All right. Thanks for joining me today. I hope I was able to give you a nice little breakdown there of how things are operating in Iran and what's going to be happening now after Raisi's death. We'll be watching for the elections on the 28th to see if any surprises come. But as I said, exceptionally unlikely. Before we go here, a couple of things that I want to say. First, take some time, head out to SpanglerForge.com, okay? SpanglerForge.com, SpanglerForge.com. This is Ben Spangler's service. He is a New York Army National Guard soldier who's a full-time bladesmith. He makes some really incredible stuff, really incredible knife work. If you're looking for outside utensils, medieval style, particularly knives, get a hold of my buddy Ben Spangler at SpanglerForge.com and he'll hook you up. He's got some great stuff. Also, if you got any questions for me, John Malik at headlinesinhistory.com. You can catch me on social, Headlines in History on YouTube, as well as Instagram. Keep an eye out in the next couple weeks. We're going to be having a couple more interviews come through. We'll continue to have episodes like these, but we just in the next few weeks have a couple individuals, couple more lieutenant colonels. I'll kind of go through Lieutenant Colonel's row here and get some great insight on foreign affairs, military conflict for some really senior leaders in the New York Army National Guard in particular. And so it should be for some good content over the next couple of weeks. And then also forgot to mention, I did an interview this week myself on the podcast that's hosted by Joshua Stewart called The Mediocre Observer. We had a great conversation. You can find his podcast, Mediocre Observer, anywhere where you find your podcast. But I had a great conversation about FISA in particular. He wanted to know about how the FISA process works. There's some good nuggets in there if you're interested in that. And we also talked about Gaza and some other things. So great conversation with Josh over there, and check out that latest episode. And we'll be you'll find me on a couple others coming up soon. I've got one that I've brought up before as a potential that's going to be happening in June. That's still on the calendar. So watch out for a big one. I'll bring it up again next week. That one's going to be visual as well. It'll be on YouTube. So I'll let you know when it's been completed and we get it out there. So we're staying busy. Glad that you're here with us and sticking with us here on Headlines in History, and look forward to talking to everybody next week.